In 1883, the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association held their annual meeting in Minneapolis. The event was convened by the newly elected president of the Suffrage Association and newly arrived Minnesotan, Dr. Martha Ripley. Martha Rogers Ripley grew up in Iowa, where her farmer father was involved in the Underground Railroad. As a teen, she volunteered on Civil War efforts and then began teaching. After finishing medical school, a 40-year-old Ripley and her husband moved to Minneapolis, where she began her practice as one of Minnesota's first female physicians. Her focus was on obstetrics and safe childbirth. She herself was a mother of 3. She quickly was elected president of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association, in part because of the recommendation of national leader Lucy Stone. Dr. Ripley said her duty was to not keep silent when wrong exists. Among the many misogynistic wrongs in Minnesota was legal latitude for the mistreatment of girls.
It sounds hideous today, but I want to bring it up. Age of consent, meaning in those days when sexual activity with a girl was allowed, and that would be allowed through matrimony, but it had been 10.
The age of consent in Minnesota was 10. Dr. Ripley attempted to change that. The state legislature pushed back and reaffirmed men's control over girls. Ripley described Minnesota's statutes as worthy of the Dark Ages. Dr. Ripley fought to move the age to 18, but had to settle for 14 as the age of consent. In her frustration, and where she saw her vote as her voice, she personally petitioned the legislature for the vote, which was said to have been met with laughter and ridicule. Another grim reality of life for women in the 19th century were the high levels of mortality during childbirth. But another arcane policy of the era was that unmarried women could not be admitted to hospitals to give birth. In 1886, Dr. Ripley rented a small home and opened the maternity hospital, which would serve poor women and other marginalized women and their babies for over half a century. Years later, and on her deathbed, it is said that the last words spoken by Dr. Martha Ripley were, "Is everything all right at the hospital?"
As in Colorado, women in California actively used their votes once they won them to address many political issues of concern to them. Here are some of them listed on this sign. Raising the minimum wage for women workers, raising the age of consent, which in many states was something like 12, establishing juvenile justice courts, and passing laws to control prostitution, not by penalizing the women, but by penalizing the men who profited from the trade. Frances Willard approached women's suffrage fundamentally differently than radicals like Susan B. Anthony had. She didn't say that women needed the votes because of abstract justice or equal rights. She didn't say that women needed the vote because they had the same rights and the same capacities and the same obligations as men, although she did think that they did. But instead, she argued that women deserve the right to vote because their obligations and the sphere in which they lived and worked was so fundamentally different, and the issues that concerned them were so different from men that men could not be trusted to represent them. Women needed to go into politics to protect their own interests. In particular, and this was her crucial argument, women needed the vote to protect their homes. In other words, from that prior picture, that picture of women standing inside the door, they needed to step outside the door and go into public to protect their families, their homes, their husbands, and especially their children. Willard captured this argument in a brilliant move that we would call rebranding. Women's suffrage was a term which was considered radical, associated with masculine women, like that's Susan B. Anthony. And so she took it and she rebranded it, and she called it the Home Protection Ballot. This was a brilliant move that vaulted these conventional late 19th century women over the alleged wall that separated women's private and men's public spheres.
BBC World Service. I'm Mike Williams with The Y Factor. Today, the age of consent, the age at which a person is considered by law to be capable of agreeing to sex. It's just a number, but a number which varies greatly around the world and which is bound up with child protection, with notions of honor and marriage, with concerns about paedophilia and society's strange obsession with lust.
Most countries, the age of consent is 14 to 18, but there's a few where it's as low as 12 or as old as 21. So there's quite a broad range, and I think that reflects the fact that this is a social construct that we've created, really. It's not based on any hard and fast scientific evidence.
Dr. Lucy Maddox is a clinical psychologist with the UK's National Health Service.
Teenagers, in fact, are particularly vulnerable to social pressures. So because their frontal lobes, so the bit of the brain which is responsible for problem solving and for decision making, is a bit less well developed, and the bits of their brain that are really to do with social reward are kind of hypersensitive, it means that they might be extremely sensitive to social pressures. So that might lead us to think that having an age of consent in the late teens might be quite helpful.
I became pregnant when I was 15 years old. He was 8 years older than me.
Aissatou Dieng from the Gambia, a place where the age of consent is 18. She's now 28 years old and a campaigner for the rights of women and girls. At the time, legally, you weren't able to consent, but I wonder if in your mind you did consent. And did you understand, most importantly, what that meant, what the consequences would be?
It wasn't something that I expected. It wasn't something that I planned. Because imagine being the most intelligent child in your family, everybody was looking up to you. It was something that I didn't only disappoint my family, but I actually disappointed myself that time. But later, as I grew up, I realized how women are, how girls are treated, and it is time for us to stand up and say no to some of those abuses and exploitation.
Underage sex is permitted in the Gambia as long as the child is married, and that's true elsewhere as well. Here's Jerison Lansdowne, a children's rights advocate and one who's often worked as a consultant to the United Nations.
If you've got a country where it's completely frowned on and completely unacceptable for anyone to have sex outside marriage, then those countries will want to have the same age of sexual consent as marriage. In more liberal countries in the West, for example, where it's widely acknowledged, tolerated, accepted that people have sex when they're much younger and outside marriage, then you need a law which both acknowledges that and protects children from abuse at the same time. So the role of an age of consent is partly to protect from older men trying to have sex or having sex with children.
Absolutely, absolutely. The laws were created to try to punish older boys and men.
Dr. Elizabeth Schroeder is an expert on sexuality education. She's based in the United States, but has taught around the world.
We are a world that wants to punish before we educate. And punishing folks, putting them into jail, is something that is a consequence for their actions, but it does nothing to change their behavior. And that's really something that is missing, to really help change somebody's attitudes to say, this is not something you should be doing, versus we're just going to pop you into jail and those are your consequences. There has to be a combination. For example, outside of the U.S. and some of the African countries, statutory rape laws are designed to combat child marriage. So if you can't have sex with a 13 or 14-year-old girl, that includes in marriage. And so it is a very specific effort to try to end the practice of child marriage, a 13-year-old and a 45-year-old.
I lost my dad when I was 3, so my mother was playing the role of both parents. She's been very supportive, but my paternal uncles believed that the only way I can cover the shame I caused the family was to get married as soon as I gave birth to my baby. But my mother stood by me and said, no, my daughter is going back to school. So she took my child when my child was just 6 months old and sent me back to school. So it was because of my mother that I escaped being a child bride.
Isa too was one of the lucky ones, but many girls are not so fortunate. Here's Helena Minshew from the International Women's Health Coalition.
A number of people have looked at the issue of what causes child marriage. And a lot of times what we hear out of that research is that parents are marrying their daughters off to, quote unquote, protect them. And we often think that that means protect girls from sexual assault or from pregnancy out of wedlock. But the International Women's Health Coalition has a partner in Cameroon, the Association for the Struggle Against Violence Against Women, who has recently conducted research on the root causes of child marriage in the extreme north of Cameroon. And they found the same thing. Parents would initially say protection. But what they found is that respondents actually meant protection of the honor of fathers. So an unwed sexually active daughter brought shame upon the father, brought shame upon the family. An unwed daughter with a child, even more so. And so parents actually were marrying their daughters off not to protect the girl, but to protect themselves from shame.
Restrictions on the sexual activity of girls have a long history, and the first recorded law defining an age of consent dates back to 13th century England, when a statute made it an offence to ravish a maiden within age, with or without her consent. A maiden within age was taken to mean a girl below the marriageable age, at that time 12 years old.
The history is quite sexist because it came from actually old England, really looking at the purity of girls. It was a very gendered thing where they wanted to make sure at the time that girls' virginity was being protected and they were being, quote unquote, preyed upon by older men. The consequence for men of having sex with a girl who was underage was criminal prosecution. Interestingly enough, they were not considered sexual crimes originally. Because girls and women were seen as men's property, it was a crime against property, not a sexual crime the way we have it defined today.
But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief that thou, her maid, art far.
One of the greatest love stories ever told.
Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name. Or, if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet.
We don't know for certain how old Romeo was. Most scholars settle on 16 or older. But Shakespeare's text is clear. Juliet was just 13.
My child is yet a stranger in the world. She hath not seen the change of 14 years. Let 2 more summers wither in their pride, ere we may think her ripe to be a bride.
Younger than she our happy mother's maid.
And too soon marred are those so early made. Earth has swallowed all my hopes but she's the hopeful lady of my earth. But woo her, gentle Paris, get her heart, my will to her consent is but a part. And she agreed within her scope.
In many parts of the world these days, the union of Romeo and Juliet would probably provoke a visit from the police or social services. But strangely, in modern-day Verona, it would be legal. The age of consent in Italy is 14, with an exception if the participants are close in age. A 13-year-old may engage in sexual activity with a partner as long as the two of them are within 3 years of each other. Several countries take a similar approach, and these exemptions are known as Romeo and Juliet clauses.
There's so many cases where you have a younger person and an older person in a relationship, but the parents know both partners and there's absolutely no problem with it. So really you have to have somebody make a complaint about the situation. There have been exceptions to that, however, and there was a case years ago in the United States where an older boy was in a relationship with a younger girl. She got pregnant, had a baby, and he was going to stay with her. They wanted to get married. The parents knew both of them, and they supported this. The government in one state actually followed them. They moved to another state and arrested him for statutory rape, even though the parents had consented. So we really have to look at these and say, what are we trying to do here? People people need to be able to consent for themselves if the law says that they can. And if you have parents who can consent for their children, then you have to let them be and let them do that.
While much of the debate over consent revolves around protecting young girls from older men, that's not always the case.
Women are not perceived, generally speaking, as sexual predators, sexual threats in the way that men are.
There are still cases in the United States that have happened recently where the judge has thrown out the case and said, how could a woman possibly harm a boy?
I mean, it does happen occasionally. You've had the odd case in this country where a woman teacher is engaged in a sexual relationship with a younger teenage boy. Now it does tend to be viewed as a criminal offence and a serious breach of professional conduct.
But there really is this inherent idea that if it's a woman who's older, she cannot harm a younger partner.
For much of history, laws have regulated relationships between women and men, girls and boys. But when it comes to sex, there are other permutations.
If we look at homosexual relationships, you get a slightly different picture. So in this country, for example, we used to have a much higher age of consent for homosexual relationships than we did for heterosexual relationships. And that was largely, I suppose, a tradition of strong social, moral, religious disapproval of those relationships. Clearly that's now changed and the relationships are the same. But of course, in many parts of the world, in Africa and in other regions too, it is illegal still. So there's no age of consent because it's actually prohibited right across the board. Female-female relationships have traditionally been much more invisible because it was never assumed that sex could take place without a man. It was defined in male terms. It was defined through penetration, if you like. So there's been much less moral panic in the past, I suppose, about lesbian relationships than there is about male relationships, which is seen in many parts of the world as deeply threatening and also coercive because men are seen as more predatory than women and therefore men are perceived as preying on young boys, are seen as a greater threat.
There's a very well-known play here in the States called The Vagina Monologues. It's a number of monologues from interviews of women all about sex and sexuality and how they learned about their bodies and came to value and celebrate their bodies. And one of these monologues is a sexual awakening between remembering a 15-year-old girl and a woman who's in her 30s.
She invites me into her car. She asks me if I like to kiss boys, and I say, no, I do not like to do that. Then she says she wants to show me something, and she leans over, and she kisses me so softly on the lips, with her lips. And then she puts her tongue in my mouth. Wow. She asks my mama if I can spend the night, and my mama's delighted that such a beautiful, successful woman has taken an interest in me.
And I remember the first time I saw the show and that monologue happened from the perspective of the 15-year-old, the lights went down when it was over and I actually audibly heard people say, oh, like this was a beautiful thing. And all I could think was, if that 30-year-old was a man, you would be outraged by this. So what is this different value that boys and men are the bad guys here? If we're really saying that age is the deciding factor, then age must apply to all genders.
And if you change the pronouns she to he, you can understand clearly what Elizabeth Schroeder means.
Then he says he wants to show me something. And he leans over and he kisses me so softly on the lips with his lips. And then he puts his tongue in my mouth. Wow. He asked my mama if I can spend the night, and my mama's delighted. Such a beautiful, successful man has taken an interest in me.
Let's try talking about a number. 12 seems, to me, too low. 21 seems, to me, to be rather high. Where do you stand on those two numbers? I mean, can we reach a number, you and I?
That's an interesting question, isn't it? Because that sort of reflects where we're at, where the numbers come from anyway. It has just been created by conversations with people thinking about which number is best. So we could sit here and have a conversation, and that conversation would be influenced by my background, by your background, by our ideas of what's okay and what's not okay. But in a way, I think what's more important is that we think about the context around sexual experiences and the pressures that are on teenagers and what we can do to help.
In Sweden, there was a proposal to reduce the age of consent by parliamentarians, and the Ombudsman for Children undertook a national survey, online survey with children, and the children didn't want the age lowered. They wanted it to stay higher. So clearly children were seeing it as a form of protection, and they didn't feel the fact that they could have sex and could make decisions about sex was sufficient to justify having a lower age of recognition.
We also really need to look at what our laws really trying to regulate here. So are we trying to protect girls from early sexual activity because it's going to lead to early pregnancy, and that's incredibly difficult on girls' bodies? Are we trying to ensure that girls are not sexually exploited or sexually abused? Or are we trying to restrict sexual activity because the sexual activity of girls continues to be tied to the honor of families and fathers and communities? Are we looking at boys having sex at, say, age 16 the same way that we look at girls having sex at age 16? Or do there continue to be gender imbalances there and gender inequality in how we view sex?
I don't think a girl can give consent to sex when she's below 18 because she's still a child. She's not capable to say, yes, I want to have sex. Maybe she don't even yet understand the consequences of having sex at that tender age.
Do you think that this notion of an age of consent is useful?
It is very, very useful for the young generation of girls, both boys and girls, because if girls realize the importance of giving consent, then they will then realize that they don't have to be forced to do it. It has to come from them.
My answer to whether there should be an age of consent at all is maybe. And I say maybe because it really depends on where one lives and what is the desired outcome for it. In some of the countries, when they're using the age of consent in order to delay or eliminate the practice of child marriage, I think absolutely that works very well. In other countries, I think it's hugely problematic. If someone is able to get behind the wheel of a car and drive a car at age 16, but they can't consent to have sex until 17, they're contradictory. I'd love to see the research or the legal rationale behind why that age.
Do you think having an age of consent is useful, helpful for teenagers?
I think it is, because I think it gives them that way out. If they want to say no, it gives them a bit of a backup, and it also perhaps helps them pause for thought and think about whether they actually do want to be engaging in a sexual experience. And particularly in this currently changing digital landscape that we're in, where in fact there's all sorts of sexual pressures in the digital media or in things that people are being asked to send each other pictures of themselves, that kind of thing.
Do you think it's possible that we will ever have consensus on a universal age of consent?
No. Even in a specific country, and certainly not worldwide, there are too many differences in cultural values and mores, and there are too many different ways that people see gender for there to be one particular way of looking at age of consent.
Thanks for listening to The Y Factor. If you'd like to hear more episodes, there's a wide range of programs on our website, from collecting to sacrifice to suicide, lists and laughter, drawing and diaries. Visit bbcworldservice.com/Y Factor.